Welcome to Principal Center Radio, helping you build capacity for instructional leadership. Here's your host, Director of the Principal Center, Dr. Justin Bader.
Welcome everyone to Principal Center Radio. I'm your host, Justin Bader, and I'm honored to welcome back to the program my good friend, Dr. Barbara Blackburn. Barbara Blackburn, PhD, is the author of more than 35 books and is a full-time consultant who works with schools around the world to help them raise the level of rigor and motivation for professional educators and students alike. Dr. Blackburn has been repeatedly named to the top 30 education gurus by Global Gurus, and she is the author with Abigail Armstrong of Rigor in the 6 through 12 Math and Science Classroom, a teacher toolkit, which we're here to talk about today.
And now, our feature presentation.
Barbara, welcome back to Principal Center Radio.
It is always good to be here, Justin, and this is always just such a pleasure.
Well, likewise, you've written many books on rigor and on supporting student learning and scaffolding and related topics. But I'm excited about this one because I was a science teacher. I was a 6th and 7th grade science teacher. It is the main thing that I taught as a classroom teacher. And I'm very interested in your thoughts and your ideas and strategies that you have in the book, as well as the many tools that you always include in your books for science teachers. So let's start, as we often do, by talking about what rigor is and what characterizes a rigorous environment, but with that specific lens of science classrooms.
When you think about the environment, because a lot of times people will ask me to go ahead and jump right into something else, and I'll stop and say, no. If we talk about rigor, you've got to talk about the environment because you need an environment that supports rigor. Because when you're asking students to work at rigorous levels, you're asking them to do something that is challenging, to do something that may be hard, to do something that is new. And if you don't have an environment that supports that, then you're really not going to accomplish what you want. So it is things like having an environment that is safe and secure. That is everything from having a place where students know they're supposed to be, whether that's assigned seats or the same group when they're working in a small group, but having that structure so that they feel safe, knowing their name. They feel like they can trust you if you know their name. And I know at the upper grades that's hard because you might have a lot of students, but that was one of the things I had to really work on was making sure I knew everybody's name because they do pay attention to whether or not you know that. It's things like providing cues for them that are helpful. So, for example, if there are 5 key steps to doing an investigation in a science classroom, then I may have those posted so that if they get in the middle of something and they forget, they have a cue that helps them because that's not a big deal. Having some helps is not a big deal. I was in a math classroom the other day in a high school where they had a word wall and people go, oh, word walls, isn't that like for elementary? Oh, they had key mathematical terms up on the board. And the interesting thing was all that was posted was the word. And so you might think, well, then how is that going to help them? Well, hopefully it will just be a cue to remember it. But if they actually went up to the word wall and lifted the flap, it had a definition. So if they didn't remember something, they could go do that. And that would also work in a science classroom. So those kinds of things help students feel safe and secure. They help them feel like they want to try.
Well, Barbara, I'm glad you mentioned word walls, and I remember having a word wall in my classroom and having that vocabulary that I could pre-teach and that students could refer to throughout the unit. And I appreciate your thoughts on that environment and relationships with students and letting them know that we know their names and creating an environment where where rigor is the expectation, where rigor is the norm. You talk in the book a little bit about learned helplessness. What is going on in our classrooms today with learned helplessness, and what can we do about that?
I think if you did a poll of teachers, you would find out there is more learned helplessness than there used to be, not less. Once people understand it, then they go, oh, I see that all the time. And some of that I think has been the pandemic that we've seen the increase. Learned helplessness is when a student has learned to be helpless. They have learned not even to try something themselves without asking for help. They're not willing to make that effort. And it starts very young. I had a neighbor She had a 2-year-old, and they were out in the front yard, and she was rolling the ball to her son, and he would pick it up and roll it back. And one time she rolled it too far and it went past him. And she immediately jumped up and ran and got the ball and brought it back in front of him. And when I was talking to her later, she asked me what I thought. And I told her, I said, "You're teaching him to be helpless. You're teaching him that if he doesn't catch the ball, you're going to go get it for him. And that is going to pay off in some negative ways later." And she was very nice about it and immediately stopped doing that. But that is sort of what happens. It starts very young, it gets worse in school. If a teacher is doing everything they can do, but the parents are still teaching that learned helplessness, you're sort of fighting an uphill battle. And so there, it really is a huge issue. And like I said, I think with the pandemic, they learned to even be more helpless because they were at home and a lot of times the parents didn't know what to do, or we're trying to do it remotely and there's only so much we could do there. So I think a lot of things have combined for the fact that students just do act helpless and are not even willing to try something simple. It doesn't matter how hard it is. I watched a student one day in a classroom. The teacher was like, "Can you tell me your," and his hand went up and said, "I need help." And she was asking him to tell her his name, and he wanted help. He didn't even wait for the question. And that is sort of the steroid sized view of learned helplessness. But we've all seen it in our classrooms where students are, "Well, I don't know how to do this." And we just explained it. And I don't know how. I need you to help me. I need you to help me. And so it's a real issue for teachers.
And I think, as a parent and educator, I think sometimes it's that, that seeking of attention. Maybe the kid just wants to connect. Maybe the kid just wants to talk and know that you're paying attention to them and they don't actually need help. And I find that that's often the case. I don't know what to do. They do have what they need to move forward, but sometimes they legitimately don't. And I remember the first time I got an assignment from a student that they had turned in where they had written IDK under almost every section. It just said IDK, IDK, IDK. What are some strategies teachers can use to avoid that IDK response from students and maybe help them get over whatever is making them feel like they can't, proffer an answer?
Okay, I think I want to do two different things. I want to talk about the IDK. I also want to talk about how do you just get students to try, instead of giving up before they try. So I want to do two separate strategies. The IDK, we have to do our best to make sure someone understands what we're teaching before we ask them to demonstrate that learning. And, I have a lot of teachers say to me, "But I really do. I mean, I went over it, but generally that's not enough." You've got to make sure you've got to do a lot of good questions during the lesson where you're checking on their understanding, not just asking one student at a time, because that's not enough. Put them in pairs, wander around and listen to what the pairs are talking about. Call on students who don't raise their hand. You really want to see who's understanding and who's not. Give them a graphic organizer to help them organize their thinking so that you can scan those and see, all right, do they have that information pulled together? So we've got to do everything we can on the front end to make sure that they actually had the opportunity to learn. And that doesn't mean repeat it 10 times. Okay. It means go at it a bunch of different ways. I talked to a high school teacher in my first book, and he taught high school social studies, but it applies in other subject areas. And he said during his 50-minute block, his goal was to teach whatever he was teaching 5 different ways. He wanted students to see it, hear it, feel it, think about it, and I can't remember what the fifth one was, but he had 5 different ways. So he did 5 10-minute chunks for anything he was teaching. And he said that his success rate went up tremendously because they were coming at it in so many different ways. So I think that's the kind of thing we've got to go at with the IDK. Does that make sense?
Give students different entry points, to give students different ways to respond. You have a lot of graphic organizers in the book, correct?
I do. I love graphic organizers. But what I also want to do, because I was thinking, if I was a teacher listening to this, what else would I want to know about learned helplessness? And I would want to know, just tell me a strategy when they won't even try. And this strategy is so great. It takes some time. You have to spend a little bit of time on it, but it really can work to break that habit. And what you do is, let's say I've got 3 students who just will not even try. And I have just taught a lesson and I've asked them to do something, write a paragraph or work on 5 problems or whatever. I want them to do something. And immediately their hands go up. All right, I have a strategy with them. Their parents know about the strategy. They know about the strategy. My administrator knows about the strategy, and you're going to see why in a minute. So what happens is when they raise their hand, I turn a timer to 3 minutes. And I say, just a reminder, everybody has to work at least 3 minutes before I provide any help. Well, that doesn't help those three. So I have to go wander around and see them and say, nope, you've got to work 3 minutes. I've got the timer going. You've got to at least try. You've got to at least try to write an answer. All right, end of 3 minutes. I go check on the three of them. They haven't done anything because they've got learned helplessness. So they haven't even written anything down. And I say, great. The goal here is that you've got to at least try on your own before I will provide any help. So I'm going to turn the timer back to 3 minutes and you need to get started. And I'm going to teach them to unbreak that habit they have. And if I've only got one student, it's really easy because I can just do it right there at the desk and nobody else knows. But if I've got a couple, I've got to sort of do it a little more publicly. And it may take weeks to break that habit, but it is worth the trouble to get them to learn that they have to try before you're going to provide help. Now, the reason it's so important that parents and your administrator know is you've got a student whose hand is raised, your administrator walks in, and what your administrator notices is you aren't helping the student who's got their hand raised. They need to know what's going on with that strategy so they know that you're being intentional. You're not ignoring that student for no reason. You have a higher purpose in mind. And so you don't need to get marked down for that. So that's why you want everybody on board.
Yeah, I think that's great advice because anything taken out of context like that can can be interpreted in the worst possible light, even if it's a very intentional plan. So yeah, proactive communication, absolutely. I wanted to ask if I could about the next generation science standards because I find that a lot of people are not really aware that they exist, and then when they look at the next generation science standards, they are often quite shocked at the level of rigor, at the types of tasks that students are asked to do, at the number of standards. What's your take on those standards?
I'm really impressed by them. They are rigorous. They should be rigorous. If we're going to have national standards that we're looking to guide what we are doing, they should be held up at a high level because then our job is to help our students get there. I know that when I first started researching them, I looked at things like they should reflect the interconnected nature of science as it is practiced and experienced in the real world. And I thought, what does that really look like? Well, in the real world, we don't stop and do chemistry and stop and do physics and stop and do biology. We do science. All of those things are interconnected and there are different things that happen in different ways. And so I really, really think that they're important. And if you are a secondary science teacher, you absolutely want to make sure, just Google next generation science standards. If you are a secondary math teacher, you want to Google your NCTM standards, which are very comprehensive also, and they are also rigorous, and really take a look at those to see what they're saying. And I'm not going to tell you that they should replace your state standards in any way, shape, or form. But what they can do is inform what you're already doing because your state standards generally do at least pay attention to the same things. So you're not going to find them to be substantially different, but there are things sometimes you will find that are a little different, and they can help you plan your instruction better.
Absolutely. And the tasks can be, yeah, quite challenging. One resource I'll mention for people is openscied.org, which has lots of units that are written specifically to those standards. And Amy has written some of those units, and it's incredible to see just the amount of work that goes into them. And trying to wing it, trying to just kind of make things up as you go along, I think is just next to impossible with those standards. So it's always good to have something to build on and something to work from.
I find really good resources online without having to spend 20 hours looking for things. If I put the word research in front of them, or if I go to things like national standards and national groups, the nonprofit groups that are really geared to them, I have people, probably one of the top questions I get from teachers is, do you ever use, and they'll name a site that where teachers have to pay to get resources. And a lot of those are cute. A lot of them are copyright violations, but I don't necessarily find they're the best resources. The best resource I ever found for graphic organizers was from a state department in a state, and they had a 28-page document, and it was unbelievable. So I really encourage you to use those kinds of resources because I think you'll find them to be very helpful.
Absolutely. Well, I want to make sure we get to math because math is one of the main topics of the book, and we've been talking mostly about science. But if I could ask one more science question, one of the things that I really struggled with, Barbara, as a science teacher was how much do I scaffold my students' lab writing? Because I found that I could give them blank notebooks and have them do, their own lab reports from start to finish, or I could give them basically fill in the blank worksheets and didn't feel that either one of those was ideal. Like I felt there were some students who really needed some form of scaffolding, but if I scaffolded too much, then they were missing part of what they needed to be getting from the process of doing a lab report themselves. So thinking specifically about science writing for for labs where there's a hypothesis, there's something people students do, there are conclusions and all that, and just the different types of support that students need. What's your take on that issue?
Um, I think there's a middle ground. Now, some students need very much structure. Okay, so when you've got a student who needs that, it's okay to give it to them. Just know that long term, you want to ease them off. And some students don't need any structure at all. But you've got this middle group, they just need a part. With the sample structured writing guide, what they do is like for section one, they're going to have to come up with their hypothesis or the problem or that kind of thing. And so instead of giving them a sentence prompt, we give them three questions. What am I investigating? Is there a problem I need to solve? What questions am I to formulate as I move through this investigation? And if you answer those three and then turn it into one sentence, you've just done it. But that's not too much. And then as you go into the inquiry process where they're going to have to describe the process, you don't give them everything. You just say step one, step two, three, step four, step five, and say you may use words like first, then, or next. So you're not giving them too much. You're just giving them that part that's there in between. And so I really find that that kind of structure can be very helpful.
I appreciate your comments about, if the student needs it, give it to them. If we have students with IEPs and they specify supports like that, if we have students who are English language learners, absolutely. We don't need to provide supports to students who don't need them if they will be a limiting factor, but we can provide them as support to students who need them. I'm remembering one time, I was very surprised when this happened, but then I realized, okay, I need to be more explicit about explaining this. I was on the overhead projector, so this gives you a sense of what the date was. Overhead projector with the marker, and I said, here are the sections I want you to write out in your lab notebook, and here's the table I want you to draw. And I modeled it for them. I said, here's how you draw this type of table because we're going to be collecting this type of data. And this was fairly early in the year. So I did all that. And then I went around and checked students' lab notebooks. And some of them had drawn the table exactly as I had shown them, but it was like 1 inch by 1 inch. Realized we need to start with a level of support that gets students to success and then pull it back. Right. So that was just kind of an eye opener for me to really be clear about, things that might be obvious to me, but might not be obvious to my students that, this is what it needs to look like. Lots of examples, lots of modeling. And that's what I always like about your books is that you have lots of examples throughout the text. Let's talk a little bit about math. And of course, I have not been a math teacher, but a lot of the strategies you talk about in the book as far as assessment and discourse apply well to math.
Let's do my favorite one. It's an idea called Flesh It Out. And it's a graphic organizer originally developed by Janet Allen for reading to teach like character analysis in a reading classroom. So over the years, I've been working with teachers, math and science teachers, and I'd give them a blank skeleton because it's what it's got is it's a skeleton, and then you flesh it out. And so I would give them a blank skeleton and say, figure out how you do it in your classroom. And it really is one that people like a lot in the classroom. So, for example, for the math one, okay, so you've got this skeleton. He's a little jaunty. He looks pretty cool for middle and high school students.
And he's an actual skeleton, right? We're not talking about just an outline. We're talking about like a Halloween style skeleton as a graphic organizer, right?
Yes, Halloween type skeleton. And like I said, it's cute. He's got a little attitude. I didn't want the kind that looked like in a high school science classroom. Okay. I didn't want that stand up one. So I had some students who designed this one for me. So what happens is there's different pieces coming out from the skeleton. So coming out of the head is a thought bubble where they put down their prior knowledge. So they're getting ready to work a word problem that is very challenging. You don't do this all the time. You just do it when they need to. So the first thing they have to do is scan that word problem and then do any prior knowledge that they have about it. Oh, okay, I can see that's got negative numbers. So that's going to mean I have to pay attention to that. Which ones are positive and which ones are negative. So they just jot down their prior knowledge. Coming out of the mouth, they restate the question. What is the problem asking me to do? So they have to restate it. So they have to understand what the question is, because too often they don't. They get into solving it and they don't know what's going on. So we're going to stop and restate the question, understand what it is. Then, on one hand, it's the information needed to solve the problem. All right. So I have to know what the variable is or what the independent variable is, whatever. Right. So you've got that. Now, the foot, which is actually the Achilles heel, is any misconceptions. So, do I have any misconceptions, or I may need to come back to that and see if I had any places that I did it? The other hand is to justify your solution. So, they have to justify why they are correct. And then the heart is they have to relate their answer to real life. So, they have to take it beyond just the problem. So, that kind of similarity with a graphic organizer, it's different, but it's really interesting for teachers. And for science, it's things like the hypothesis, what led you to the hypothesis, the procedure, what could go wrong, those kinds of things. So we'll have both of those up for you. But that strategy, oftentimes students get really good at computation and they get really good at word problems that are computation. But then they get to a word problem that's a much more rigorous level and they're not sure what to do and they forget what they're supposed to do. So a graphic organizer like this helps them out. And so I really like it because it is a cute little skeleton and it can go with any subject area.
But one thing I wanted to make sure that we got to is the idea of discourse, because we know it can be so powerful for students to talk with one another about their ideas. And yet, in the math and science classroom, we're often asking students to do a different kind of talking with their peers, where it's not just, what do you think about this? What's your experience been? But we're actually asking students to engage in fairly specific types of discussions. And one of the things that I think we struggle with as educators is, how do I make sure that my students are actually talking about what I want them to talk about and actually making productive use of that time, and not confusing one another, not talking about what are you going to do this weekend, but actually, talking about our content. How can we think about classroom discourse, and how can we set it up so that it actually ends up being about what the lesson is about?
Yeah, I think you do have to think about what discourse is. I think a lot of people do classroom talk. And that's the not only just who won the football game last night, but that's also just general talk in the classroom. Discourse very specifically focuses on the content being taught. It uses academic vocabulary. It is promoting critical thinking. All students really do participate and reflection is encouraged. That's a different way of thinking about it. And part of it is as simple as what we start with. So if I put my students in groups of four, we'll do a math one since we've been doing science, and I give them a problem to solve. They'll talk a little bit about the problem, but that's not really what they're going to talk about. And if the problem is about pizza, they're going to talk about what kind of pizza they like best. So, what I have to do is structure my prompt. So, instead, I'm going to say, here's a problem that was solved using three different strategies. Your group has to determine which of those strategies is the most efficient and explain why. I don't give them as much wiggle room. That's a very structured prompt. Okay. So again, instead of in a science classroom, instead of here are the steps to complete a lab, I'm going to say research scientific evidence around a topic, biomes, and then develop a line of inquiry that you could investigate further. So if I structure what they're doing, then I'm going to increase my chances of getting discourse. And if that's not enough for them, what I'm going to do is give them some prompts. And a lot of times I'll give them these on a sheet of paper or on slips of paper that they can pull. And they're things like, why do you think? How did you decide? Why did you choose to? Have you considered? How might a mathematician? What would a scientist do? and giving them some additional prompts that they can ask each other to keep people focused. And so I think that's really critical to discourse.
A lot of it comes down to the setup.
Absolutely. And we can control every bit of that. Those are things we can control. It's not probably the way we were taught. I mean, certainly when you and I were in school, it was here's a problem, get in a group. And as long as the group wasn't talking too loud, you were okay. As long as one person did the work. But that's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the many tools you have to support that, and lots of topics we don't have time for today, like assessment and collaboration with your colleagues to improve rigor. But definitely want to encourage people to check out the book Rigor in the 6 through 12 Math and Science Classroom, a teacher toolkit. And we'll post the resources from the book that Barbara mentioned. Barbara, if people want to get in touch with you and find you online, where are some of the best places for them to go?
Go to my website, barbarablackburnonline.com. There are additional downloads on the website for every one of my books. All you have to do is go to free and then go to downloads and choose a book. So if you go, ooh, I'd like to learn more about assessment, you can go to any of my books, but you can also go to the assessment book or the differentiation book. Or if you happen to be a language arts social studies teacher listening, there are language arts social studies books that are comparable to these. And we've got K-5 versions of this. There's lots of different tools there. I'm also on Facebook and Blue Sky and Twitter, not anymore, and Twitter X, and I don't even know what else. I'm probably on anything. So just search for me, Barbara Blackburn, and go to my website and you can get anything you need, whether it's about my workshops or any of my books.
Well, Barbara, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me again on Principal Center Radio.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Principal Center Radio. For more great episodes, subscribe on our website at principalcenter.com/radio.